Imagine looking at a national census, right? And you see that a specific, historically grounded population has just miraculously grown by like nearly 900%. And this is in a place where they historically never even lived.
Yeah, it's not a gradual shift over a century or anything.
Oh, exactly. It's
Ah.
this sudden, massive demographic explosion in just a few short years. You see a statistic like that, and you immediately wonder if the data is just totally broken.
Right, you have to.
So today, we are looking at how a simple checkbox on an administrative form created an impossible demographic surge. And probably more importantly, what that surge tells us about history, identity, and the lingering shadow of colonial paperwork.
Because it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. You know, when you fill out a job application or a medical intake form or a national census and you check a box that defines your race or your identity, we tend to treat that action as totally objective.
Right, like it's just cold, hard data.
Exactly. We treat it as if we are simply logging a scientific fact into a spreadsheet. But the reality of those administrative labels, according to the sources we're looking at today, is far more fluid and far more political than just a simple data point.
And to explore that, we're embarking on a deep dive into a critical review and excerpts from a really provocative book. It's called Métis, Race Recognition and the Struggle for Indigenous Peoplehood by Chris Andersen. He's a very prominent Métis academic.
Yes, and it's a fascinating read.
It really is. Now, our mission for this deep dive is very specific. We are going to strip away the dense academic jargon. We want to break this down into clear, everyday language so that even if you are a complete beginner to Indigenous history or Canadian politics, you will walk away with a profound understanding of what it actually means to be a people.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it.
We're going to look at the historical rise of the Métis Nation on the plains. We'll examine how government policies literally papered over their land rights. And we'll unpack how modern legal labels are actively overwriting genuine political history.
Because the overarching narrative that most of the public understands regarding the word Métis is deeply fundamentally misunderstood. The assumptions most people carry about that word are actually rooted in a very specific, intentional colonial framework, according to Andersen.
Right.
And his book is basically dedicated to dismantling that framework piece by piece.
So rather than starting in a courtroom or, some dusty government archives room, the book opens somewhere completely different. It opens at a party.
A really good party, actually.
Yes, specifically a ball in the year 2013.
Hmm.
Chris Andersen is attending the Iron Ball Métis, which translates to the Half-Breed Ball in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And the event is being hosted by the highly esteemed Métis elder, author, and scholar Maria Campbell. And the scene Andersen describes is just incredibly vivid and joyous.
It is. It's this massive celebration of cultural survival.
Put yourself in that room for a second.
Oh.
They're serving a 10-course meal, but it's composed of these brilliant modern riffs on traditional Métis cuisine. You have muskrat meatloaf.
Which sounds super interesting.
Right. You have beaver tail. There are fiddles playing mandolins, guitars. The music is filling the hall. People are dancing. And all around the perimeter, there's this stunning exhibition of intricate Métis material culture.
Yeah, like the historical dress and the famous, incredibly detailed floral beadwork that the Métis are known for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a space just vibrating with life.
And yet, Andersen notes that while he is standing in the middle of all this joy surrounded by his own culture, he feels this nagging sense of irritation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he cannot turn off his academic critical lens. He is looking around at this vibrant, Indigenous-led space, and he realizes that the overarching narrative, even here, still relies heavily on the concept of mixedness.
Wait, what does he mean by that? Because, when most people hear the word Métis, mixed is probably the very first synonym that comes to mind, right?
And that is the core of his frustration. The dominant narrative, even among allies and sometimes internalized within the community itself, is the idea of fur trade hybridity. It's the narrative that Métis culture is simply a blend. A little bit of First Nations culture, a little bit of European culture just stirred together. Andersen is frustrated because he argues that defining the Métis primarily by their mixedness completely ignores and erases their status as a self-determining political nation.
He gives a really striking example of how pervasive this mixedness idea is. He brings up a quote from John Ralston Saul, who is a very prominent Canadian intellectual. This is from his 2008 book, A Fair Country. Saul makes this sweeping claim that Canada is at its core a Métis civilization.
Which is a heavy claim to make.
Right. And when you first hear that, it sounds like an incredible compliment. It sounds like he is taking Indigenous heritage and placing it right at the very center of the national identity, celebrating inclusivity.
But if we look closer at the mechanics of what Saul is actually doing there, Andersen, along with other prominent Métis scholars like Brynna McDougall, argues that this is a profound form of colonial erasure.
Wait, colonial erasure, just by calling it a Métis civilization.
Yeah, but dressed up as a compliment. By calling Canada a Métis civilization, Saul is not talking about the actual historical Métis people. He is not talking about their specific territory, their unique political struggles, or their sovereignty.
Always.
He is taking the word Métis and turning it into a lowercase adjective. He is using it as a synonym for blended or multicultural.
So it's almost like, well, think about someone growing up in a household where the parents speak two different languages. Being bilingual is a trait, right, that describes a characteristic of that person. But speaking two languages doesn't automatically make you a citizen of France or Spain or any specific sovereign nation.
That's a really good analogy.
Ancestry or cultural blending does not equal political citizenship. So why does society assume that having mixed blood automatically equates to being part of the Métis Nation?
And the consequence of that assumption is where Andersen introduces a really vital concept, racialization. Defining the Métis simply as mixed relies entirely on a colonial racial hierarchy. Let's follow the logic of this framework for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
If the defining unique characteristic of the Métis is that they are mixed, the unspoken corollary is that First Nations and Inuit people must therefore be pure.
Which is complete biological myth. Human populations, especially in vast trading networks like North America before and after European contact, have always intermingled.
Always. All Indigenous peoples have complex histories of intermarriage, adoption, and blending. But Andersen points out that by insisting that the Métis are the only group defined by their hybridity, colonial administrators subtly push a very specific damaging narrative.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They create a spectrum of authenticity. First Nations are framed as purely Indigenous, and the Métis are framed as less Indigenous because they have European ancestry. It is a divide and conquer strategy that ranks indigeneity based on imagined biological purity rather than actual political or historical reality.
So the premise of mixedness isn't an objective scientific fact. It's a tool. It's a lens forced onto the population by colonial authorities to categorize people, decide who gets what rights, and determine who is considered authentic.
Exactly, which means that if we want to understand who the Métis actually are, according to Andersen, we have to throw away the biological lens entirely. He argues that Indigenous nationhood is not based on a blood quantum. It's not something you can find in a DNA test.
Right.
It's based on history, connection to territory, and a collective political consciousness.
So if being Métis is not just the biological byproduct of, a Scottish fur trader marrying a Cree woman.
Yeah.
If it's an actual political identity, how did that identity form? How did they become a recognized people?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, and to answer that, we have to travel back to the 19th century plains. We are talking about the early 1800s, the vast northern plains, primarily around the Red River settlement in what is now the Canadian province of Manitoba.
This region is the historical core of the Métis Nation, and the birth of the Métis as a distinct people, what anthropologists call ethnogenesis, was born out of a very specific, highly organized political economy. These were not just disconnected, mixed-race individuals who happened to live in the same geographic area. They forged a massive self-governing society centered around the buffalo hunt and the fur trade.
They were building a whole system.
Yeah, they developed their own economic systems, their own distinct military structures, their own laws of the hunt, and their own diplomatic relations with surrounding nations.
The sources outline a timeline of crucial events that forged this political self-consciousness. It wasn't a passive evolution, right? It was forged in conflict resistance and complex statecraft. Let's walk through these major historical markers, starting in 1816 with the Battle of Seven Oaks.
This is frequently cited as a foundational moment of Métis nationalism. The context here is a massive corporate rivalry. You had the Hudson's Bay Company, the HBC, which claimed an absolute monopoly over the entire region, and they were trying to enforce agricultural policies that would restrict the trade of pemmican.
And we should quickly explain pemmican because it's so important here. Pemmican was essentially the fuel of the fur trade. It was a highly nutritious, long-lasting provision made of dried buffalo meat, fat, and berries.
It was literally the energy bar that kept the fur trade running.
Yeah, exactly. And the Métis were the primary producers and suppliers of pemmican, and they were aligned with the rival Northwest Company. The HBC's restrictions were seen as an existential threat to the Métis economy and their autonomy.
So this tension boils over. A local Métis leader named Cuthbert Grant, along with a contingent of Métis supporters, ends up in an armed confrontation with the HBC Governor Robert Semple and his men at a place called Seven Oaks.
And the Métis win that battle.
They do. But what's fascinating is what happens after the battle. It's not just a skirmish, it's a cultural catalyst. This is where the famous Métis infinity flag, the white infinity symbol on a blue or red background, first flies.
Oh, wow. So that flag dates all the way back to 1816.
Yes. And it's where songs composed by the Métis bard Pierre Falcon commemorating the victory and mocking the HBC become national anthems. You can see the collective identity solidifying into nationhood right there.
That political consciousness only deepens over the next few decades. Fast forward to 1849 to the Sayers trial. The HBC is still trying to maintain its absolute iron-fisted monopoly over all trade in the region. They arrest a Métis trader named Pierre-Guillaume Sayers, accusing him of illegally trading furs. They intend to make an example of him in court.
The Métis response to this is incredible. They don't just hire a defense attorney and play by the HBC's rules. On the day of the trial, an armed contingent of hundreds of Métis men surrounds the courthouse.
Hundreds of them.
They show up in massive organized force. They intimidate the court authorities so thoroughly that while the jury technically finds Sayers guilty, the judge refuses to issue any penalty whatsoever.
That's wild.
The Métis effectively shatter the HBC's trade monopoly right then and there through a display of sheer collective power. They open up the free market for the buffalo robe trade on their own terms.
And their military and diplomatic capabilities extended far beyond dealing with just European corporations. 2 years later, in 1851, we see the Battle of Grand Coteau. This is a profound moment of intersocietal relations.
Right. This is a really key event.
A relatively small Métis buffalo hunting brigade is out on the plains when they are attacked by a vastly larger Sioux force over territorial hunting disputes. Using their highly organized, disciplined hunting tactics like circling their Red River carts into defensive barricades and utilizing sharpshooters, the Métis successfully defend themselves against overwhelming odds over 2 days of intense fighting.
It's an incredible tactical victory, but again, it's the aftermath that matters most. This battle leads directly to a nation-to-nation treaty between the Métis and the Sioux.
A formal treaty.
Yes. They sit down and negotiate an agreement to share the hunting territory moving forward. That isn't just a group of individuals defending themselves, that is diplomacy. That is two sovereign nations recognizing each other.
Which sets the stage for the most famous and ultimately tragic assertions of Métis sovereignty. The Red River Resistance of 1869 to 1870 and the Northwest Uprising of 1885. In the late 1860s, the newly formed nation-state of Canada essentially purchased the vast Western Territory from the Hudson's Bay Company.
And they did this without any consultation with the tens of thousands of Indigenous people who actually lived there, governed the land, and called it home.
Which is just, it's unfathomable today, but that's what happened. The Métis refused to be treated as property to be bought and sold. Led by brilliant, complex figures like Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, they form provisional governments. They literally draft lists of rights and demands. In 1870, they forced the Canadian government to the negotiating table, demanding that Manitoba enter the Confederation as a province with specific protections for Métis lands, language, and culture.
And when the Canadian state consistently failed to live up to those negotiated promises, allowing settlers to encroach on Métis lands further west, the Métis took up arms again in 1885 at Batoche.
I want to pause here because the historical interpretation of these events is highly debated in the sources. You have some historians who look at all of this, Seven Oaks' trial, the resistances, and they argue, well, these weren't acts of nationalism. The Métis were just protecting their economic class interests as fur traders, or they were just acting out of kinship solidarity, protecting their immediate families.
Yeah, that's a common counter-argument.
It raises a really tricky question. Does an indigenous group need to look exactly like a traditional European nation-state with hard borders, a centralized parliament, standing armies, passport control to be considered a legitimate people?
Andersen tackles that critique head-on, and it is a vital part of his argument. He states that trying to force 19th century European concepts of the nation-state onto indigenous realities is a fundamental analytical flaw.
Okay.
Indigenous nationhood operates on a different paradigm. It is deeply fundamentally political, but it is organized around intersocietal relationships rather than rigid cartographic borders.
It's about the network, not the fence.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And not only that, but it is sustained by vast, complex kinship networks that have immense political weight. Take the Iron Alliance, for example.
Yeah, Iron Alliance, right.
This was a powerful, long-standing political and military confederacy that the Métis formed alongside the Nahiawak, the Plains Cree, the Assiniboine, and the Saulteaux peoples. This alliance dictated the geopolitics of the Northern Plains for decades.
So when leaders like Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont mobilized their people, they weren't just rallying a random collection of mixed-race individuals who happened to be angry about property lines.
No, not at all.
They were drawing on generations of collective memory, shared struggles, established diplomatic alliances, and horizontal comradeship. They were a distinct political collectivity. They knew exactly who they were.
But the Canadian state, focused entirely on Western expansion and resource extraction, refused to accept that sovereignty. The aftermath of the 1885 Northwest Uprising was a devastating turning point. The Métis forces were defeated at Batoche. Louis Riel was captured, tried for treason, and hanged by the Canadian government.
The military conflict effectively ended there.
It did. But the Canadian state didn't stop its campaign of dispossession. They simply changed their methodology. They shifted away from military force and deployed a weapon that was arguably much more devastating and much harder to fight against: bureaucratic administration.
And this transition brings us to the tragedy of the scrip system. After 1885, the Canadian government had a massive logistical goal. They wanted to open up the Western Plains for an influx of white European settlers. To do that legally under their own laws, they had to somehow extinguish what they call the Indian title to the land.
For First Nations, the government utilized the treaty system. Now, the numbered treaties were deeply flawed, exploitative, and heavily coercive in their own right. But fundamentally, the treaty process did theoretically deal with First Nations communities as collective.
Right, created reserves.
Yeah, which provided a collective shared land base, however inadequate. But the government absolutely refused to deal with the Métis as a collective nation. They refused to negotiate treaties with them. Instead, they instituted scrip.
I think a lot of people might have heard the word scrip in passing, maybe in a history class, but without understanding the actual mechanics of it. How did this system actually function on the ground?
Scrip was essentially an administrative certificate, and crucially, it was handed out to individual Métis heads of families rather than to the community as a whole.
Individual certificate.
Exactly. The government created two distinct types of scrip. First, there was money scrip. This was literally a piece of paper, a promissory note payable to the bearer worth a specific dollar amount, often $160 or $240. That coupon could supposedly be applied toward the purchase of federal Dominion lands.
Okay, and the second type?
Second, there was land scrip, which was a certificate granting the bearer the right to claim a specific acreage of land, usually a 160-acre or 240-acre homestead.
So if you try to visualize this, instead of recognizing a sovereign nation's collective right to the territory they had governed for generations, the state essentially handed out individual, highly exploitable coupons.
Yeah, coupons is a painfully accurate word for it.
And they handed them out, knowing full well that an entire industry of predatory speculators was waiting right outside the distribution office to separate the Métis from those certificates.
The level of exploitation was staggering. The scrip system was intentionally convoluted. The administrative hurdles required to actually redeem a land scrip certificate for a viable piece of farmland were massive. A Métis family might receive a certificate, but the land available to claim might be hundreds of miles away, completely disconnecting them from their kinship networks and their historical communities.
And this complexity immediately created a massive, highly lucrative secondary market for speculators.
Oh, absolutely. Syndicates of land speculators, lawyers, and bankers would literally follow the government scrip commissioners from town to town. They would set up shop right next door, and they weaponized the desperate poverty of the Métis.
Because things were really bad on the plains at this point.
You have to remember the context. The buffalo herds had been intentionally decimated. The traditional Métis economy was in ruins, and families were literally starving. Speculators used fraud, coercion, forgery, and the immediate need for cash to buy these scrip certificates for pennies on the dollar.
The demographic and geographic statistics in the sources regarding this loss are just absolutely nauseating. If you go back to the Manitoba Act of 1870, the government explicitly promised 1.4 million acres of land specifically to the children of the Métis. The stated goal was to give them a permanent land base to protect their society from the impending tidal wave of incoming settlers.
Right, that was the promise.
But the government intentionally delayed the distribution of that land for over a decade. By the time it was finally sorted out, the rampant fraud and speculation meant that 85% of that promised land was lost. 85%. It never went to Métis families. It ended up entirely in the hands of white land speculators.
The sheer scale of that dispossession caused a demographic collapse. Within the span of a single generation, the Métis went from constituting roughly 80% of the total population of Manitoba to becoming a marginalized, dispersed, and impoverished minority within their own homeland.
From 80% to a minority.
Yes. They were pushed to the physical and social margins. Many were forced to live as squatters on pieces of public land called road allowances, literally the strips of land reserved for future highways. Others were pushed further west and north, fleeing the settler influx. It was the systematic, administrative dismantling of a nation.
And this is where we really see the government's racial definitions doing the malicious work of the state. The federal commissioners who were traveling the plains, handing out scrip or negotiating treaties, were constantly arbitrarily changing the rules about who was classified as an Indian and who was classified as a half-breed.
It had almost nothing to do with biology.
And even less to do with how the people actually identified themselves.
The fluidity of these colonial categories is incredibly revealing. The government would frequently move individuals or entire communities back and forth between the Indian category and the half-breed category purely based on administrative convenience or to minimize the state's financial obligations.
Wait, can you give an example of that?
Sure. So, for example, if a specific community was starving and required government rations under the terms of a treaty, an Indian agent might suddenly decide that those people were actually half-breeds. They would be forcibly removed from the treaty list, handed a one-time scrip certificate, and cut off from any ongoing treaty rations or support.
Wow. The government was essentially using identity as a ledger trick to balance their budget.
Exactly.
And we also have to highlight the profoundly sexist provisions embedded in Canadian law, specifically the Indian Act. Under the law at the time, if a woman who was legally recognized as a status Indian married a man who did not have status, which included Métis men, non-status Indian men, or white men, she legally instantly lost her Indian status.
She was legally stripped of her identity by the state. She was forced to leave her reserve community cut off from her family and her resources, and often ended up living within Métis communities. The Canadian government was literally creating and destroying Indigenous identities with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen.
The combination of the scrip system and the exclusionary rules of the Indian Act created a massive legal no-man's land for the Métis. For over a century following the 1885 resistance, they were rendered largely invisible within the Canadian legal apparatus.
They were caught right in the middle.
Yeah, they weren't recognized under the Indian Act, so they had no federal protections or recognized land base. But they also certainly weren't treated as equal citizens within white settler society. They were trapped in an engineered invisibility.
Which brings us to the modern era and to the profound complexities of how the legal system has attempted to address this historical injustice. The Métis never stopped fighting for recognition. They formed provincial and national political organizations continuously lobbying the state.
Right. They were always fighting back.
And eventually these battles reached the highest courts in the land. But Andersen argues in his book that when the justice system finally attempted to draw a map of Métis rights, they used a fundamentally flawed compass.
We are talking about a landmark legal battle that changed the landscape of Indigenous law in Canada. The 2003 Supreme Court case R.V. Powley. Let's set the stage for this because it starts with a very localized conflict. Two men, a father and son named Steve and Roddy Powley, who identify as Métis, shoot a moose near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario.
And they don't have a license.
Right. They do not have a provincial hunting license. They are charged by conservation officers, and they decide to fight the charges. They take this case all the way up the judicial ladder to the Supreme Court of Canada. Their argument is that they shouldn't need a provincial license because they have an Aboriginal right to hunt for food, a right protected under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution.
And in a historic decision, the Supreme Court rules in their favor. The Powleys win the case. The court firmly affirms that the Métis are a distinct Aboriginal people with constitutionally protected rights.
Which was huge.
Massive. To determine who actually qualifies for these rights, the Supreme Court creates what becomes known as the Powley test. It's a three-part criteria. First, the individual must self-identify as a member of a Métis community. Second, they must have an ancestral connection to an historical Métis community. And third, they must be accepted by the modern Métis community.
When this decision came down in 2003, it was widely celebrated across the country. It was seen as a massive, long overdue victory. Finally, the highest court in the land is offering concrete legal recognition.
Right, people were thrilled.
But here is where Andersen's critique introduces a massive twist.
Yeah.
He argues that while the immediate outcome was obviously beneficial for Steve and Roddy Powley, the underlying reasoning that the Supreme Court used to legally define the word Métis was an absolute disaster for actual Métis nationhood.
It really was.
Well, I'm confused, though. If the Powleys won and they got their hunting rights recognized, and the Supreme Court officially validated Section 35 Métis rights, why is Andersen framing this as a disaster? I mean, a win is a win, isn't it?
It's crucial to look at how the court constructed that win. It's not just about the verdict. It's about the legal definition they cemented into law. In their written decision, the Supreme Court defined the Métis historically as communities that arose from mixed ancestry and who went on to develop customs and practices that were separate from their Indian or Inuit and European forebears.
Mixed ancestry and separate customs. Notice what is completely missing from that definition. There is zero mention of the Red River settlement. Zero mention of the historic political nation that negotiated the entry of Manitoba into Canada.
And that omission is the fatal flaw, according to the author. The court explicitly, intentionally removed the requirement of any historical or political connection to the actual historic Métis nation of the West. They officially defined Métis in Canadian constitutional law purely as a biological and social catch-all category.
Wow, so they just broadened it out completely.
Their legal formula is incredibly broad. If you have mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, and your ancestors lived somewhat separately from First Nations and European settlements, you meet the baseline criteria for being Métis.
I see the trap Andersen is pointing out here.
Yeah.
If the highest legal definition of your identity is reduced to mixed plus separate, then suddenly any group of mixed ancestry individuals anywhere in the country, people who were disenfranchised by the Indian Act or who simply have a blended family tree, can legally claim to be Métis.
Exactly. Anyone can claim it under that logic.
They can claim that identity even if they have absolutely zero historical, cultural, linguistic, or kinship ties to the actual political nation that fought at Batoche or traded pemmican on the plains. The court legally stripped the word of its specific national history and turned it into a generic umbrella term.
To explain why the Supreme Court made this choice, Andersen relies on a sociological concept developed by Pierre Bourdieu called the juridical field.
I am stuck on this idea of the juridical field. Whenever I hear sociological terms like that, it sounds incredibly dense. What does that actually mean in practice when we look at a courtroom?
Think of the legal system as a very rigid, highly specialized filter. The court operates by its own internal logic. It has a specific grammar, it relies heavily on past precedents, and it has strict rules about what constitutes valid evidence.
Okay.
It only allows arguments that fit its pre-existing shape to pass through the filter. It is incredibly resistant to radical new concepts that challenge the foundational structure of the state itself.
So it's almost like, think about trying to run a brand new, highly complex software program on a computer built in the 1980s. It doesn't matter how good the new software is. The old hardware simply cannot process the code you're feeding it. Right. It lacks the architecture to understand it.
And the consequence of that incompatibility in a legal setting is huge. The Canadian court's hardware was built on centuries of colonial precedents. Andersen highlights this incredible, very telling moment during the Supreme Court hearings for the Powley case. The lawyer representing the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Joseph Magnet, attempted to introduce a completely different argument.
What did he try to argue?
He tried to argue for a true political peoplehood definition of the Métis, drawing on international law and the principles of political self-determination.
And how did the Supreme Court justices react to that?
They essentially laughed him out of the room. They completely dismissed the argument.
Wait, they just dismissed it?
Yeah, because a peoplehood argument didn't fit their software. If the Supreme Court were to legally recognize a sovereign, self-determining Indigenous political entity operating within Canada, it would fundamentally challenge the absolute sovereignty of the Canadian state itself.
Ah, I see.
That idea was legally unthinkable within the boundaries of the juridical field. So retreating to what was comfortable and established, the court fell back on the deeply ingrained colonial narrative. They defined the Métis simply as mixed-race populations.
So the highest court in the land essentially ratifies and legalizes the myth of mixedness. But the impact of that decision doesn't stay confined to a courtroom. It bleeds out into the real world. Which brings us to the astonishing statistics we teased at the very beginning of this deep dive. What happens when you take that legally sanctioned, incredibly broad definition of Métis and hand it over to government bureaucrats tasked with conducting a national census?
You get a demographic explosion that defies all natural laws of population growth.
Let's look at the numbers from the sources. Between the 1996 Canadian census and the 2006 census, just a 10-year window, the population of people identifying as Métis nearly doubled. It jumped from roughly 204,000 people to nearly 390,000 people.
A nearly 100% increase in a single decade. From a purely demographic standpoint, that level of growth is biologically impossible through natural means like birth rates.
But the geographic breakdown is where it gets truly surreal. You look at provinces in the Maritimes on the east coast of Canada. Historically, the Métis Nation had absolutely zero presence in the Maritimes. Their homeland is thousands of kilometers to the west.
Right, it's not even close.
Yet in that same 10-year period, the province of Nova Scotia saw its Métis population increase by nearly 900%. New Brunswick saw an increase of over 400%. Unless we're supposed to believe there was a secret massive Métis baby boom happening in Halifax that nobody noticed, something else is driving these numbers.
What the data is capturing is a phenomenon that demographers refer to as ethnic mobility. The people themselves are not physically migrating across the country, and they aren't miraculously reproducing at impossible rates. They are moving categories.
They are changing how they answer the question and how they check the boxes on the census form.
Exactly. And this massive shift in self-identification is entirely driven by the ripple effects of the Pauli decision and the broader cultural narrative. The courts and the culture have convinced the public that Métis simply means anyone with a mix of Indigenous and white ancestry.
Think about how this plays out for an individual. Imagine a person living in Nova Scotia. They start researching their family genealogy and they discover a Mi'kmaq great-great-grandmother. They realize that due to the strict rules of the Indian Act, they do not qualify to be a registered status Indian.
Which happens a lot.
Right. So the next time the national census arrives in the mail, they look at the options. They know they have Indigenous ancestry. They know they have European ancestry. They look at the word Métis, which they have been told means mixed, and they check that box. They aren't trying to be malicious or fraudulent. They're simply following the logic provided by the state.
Andersen points a significant amount of his critique directly at Statistics Canada, the institution responsible for gathering this data. He argues that Statistics Canada uses a fundamentally flawed question. The census asks, are you an Aboriginal person that is First Nations Métis or Inuk?
But nowhere on the form do they provide a definition of what the word Métis actually means in this context.
And the most frustrating part of this is that Statistics Canada knows the data is deeply flawed. Through their own internal pre-testing and post-census research, they openly acknowledge that respondents are using the word Métis to mean completely different things.
Yeah, the sources mention that.
You have individuals in Manitoba checking the box because they are deeply connected citizens of the historic Red River Nation. And you have individuals in Nova Scotia checking the exact same box simply because they have a blended family tree. Statistics Canada knows they're capturing two entirely different phenomena.
If Statistics Canada, which is supposed to be the premier objective data gathering institution in the country, knows they are lumping completely disparate groups of people into one giant, statistically meaningless Métis population, why don't they just change the question? Why not add a clarifying line that asks, are you a citizen of the historic Métis Nation?
Because we have to remember the political economy of data. Changing that question is politically explosive. If Statistics Canada were to suddenly restrict the definition to the historic political nation, a massive chunk of that 390,000 person population would vanish from the spreadsheet overnight.
Oh, wow.
And there are powerful political organizations like the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and even sometimes provincial branches of the Métis National Council that utilize those inflated demographic numbers to secure government funding, negotiate for resources, and increase their political leverage.
So a larger constituency on paper directly translates to more money and more political power in Ottawa.
Exactly. And beyond the lobbying, the government bureaucracy itself is functionally paralyzed by its own rigid categories. The census does not just passively measure reality, it actively produces it.
That's a really good way of putting it.
By aggregating hundreds of thousands of disparate people under one single label, and then publishing official government-stamped reports on the growth and health of the Métis population, the state officially ratifies a false reality. It makes the myth of mixedness look like an undeniable, objective statistical fact.
It creates a massive bureaucratic feedback loop. The census publishes a report saying there are hundreds of thousands of Métis people living everywhere from coast to coast. People read those reports, which further convinces anyone with mixed ancestry that they must indeed be Métis. So when the next census rolls around, even more people check the box, inflating the numbers again. It is a self-perpetuating cycle of erasure.
It absolutely is.
And to understand just how twisted these administrative labels can get, and how much actual psychological and cultural damage they can inflict on a community's true identity, we have to look at one specific case study Andersen provides. This takes us to the communities of South and Central Labrador, specifically the Nunavut Community Council. This situation perfectly illustrates what we could call the recognition paradox.
The Labrador case is a heartbreaking illustration of the tragedy of state recognition. The communities living in South and Central Labrador are predominantly of Inuit ancestry. Culturally, historically, and genealogically, they are Inuit. But in the 1970s, when the federal government was establishing the parameters for the Labrador Inuit land claims process, they drew a completely arbitrary administrative line across the map.
Literally just a line drawn by a bureaucrat in an office.
Yes. And these specific communities happen to live just south of where that line was drawn, because of their geographic location relative to this arbitrary boundary. The state said, sorry, you fall outside the claim area. You do not count as Inuit for the purposes of this legal process. They were completely cut out of the negotiations and denied recognition of their Indigenous rights.
Imagine putting yourself in the shoes of those community leaders. You are sitting there knowing your history, knowing your culture, knowing you are Inuit. But the colossal machinery of the state refuses to recognize your existence based on a line on a map. Decades pass. They are fighting for survival, fighting for their right to hunt and fish on their own lands.
And then the Pali decision happened.
Right, then Pali comes down in 2003. The Supreme Court opens this massive legal door for mixed ancestry communities to claim Section 35 Aboriginal rights under the banner of being Métis. So what did these unrecognized Inuit communities do? To get any legal protection whatsoever from the state, they pivot.
They had to.
They begin legally forwarding their land and hunting claims as Métis. For a significant period, they literally operated under the name the Labrador Métis Nation.
And the profound irony is that even while they were doing this, the community leaders were incredibly transparent about the absurdity of the situation. In their own legal documents submitted to the courts and the government, they practically admitted what was happening. They stated clearly that they are an Inuit culture and that they were merely utilizing the constitutional descriptor Métis because it was the single solitary legal avenue the state had left open to them to protect their way of life.
It is absolutely maddening. The analogy that comes to mind is being forced to wear a name tag with someone else's name on it. Let's say the name tag says Dave every single day, just to be allowed by the security guard to enter your own house. You tell the guard, look, I'm not Dave, I'm Steve, but I will wear this tag if it's the only way you'll let me in to feed my family.
That is exactly what it felt like for them.
But here's the tragic part. After 30 years of wearing that name tag, your children grow up seeing it. They start to think their father really is named Dave. And eventually the state points to the name tag and says, see, we told you that is who you are.
The term for that is internalized misrecognition, and it is devastating. Andersen uses this specific Labrador case study to systematically dismantle a very famous political theory by the philosopher Charles Taylor, known as the politics of recognition.
What's that theory about?
Taylor's framework essentially assumes that a marginalized group's identity already exists fully formed out in the world, and the state simply needs to gracefully open its eyes and recognize it.
But Andersen is arguing that Taylor's theory totally misunderstands the mechanics of colonialism, right?
Yes, because the very act of seeking recognition from a colonial state is never neutral. It is deeply coercive. In order to be recognized, you are forced to squeeze yourself, your history, and your identity into the state's pre-made racially defined boxes. The Labrador communities had to contort their own historical narrative to fit the Supreme Court's specific legal definition of what a Métis person is supposed to be.
And those heartbreaking consequences of this process. Decades of identifying as Métis, purely for legal survival, has produced a genuine, entrenched demographic reality on the ground. There is now an entire generation, a recognized census population in Labrador, that deeply and genuinely believes they are Métis.
They have internalized the state's label.
Yeah, they have internalized the administrative label, even as their own political leaders are currently trying to correct the historical record and pivot the community back to an Inuit identity under the name Nunatugavuz. The state didn't just fail to recognize them. The process of seeking recognition forced the community to misrecognize themselves.
It is a profound generational violence enacted entirely through paperwork and legal strategy.
So let's step back and look at the massive journey we've taken today. We started this deep dive looking at a very simple, incredibly common assumption. The idea that the word Métis simply means someone of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry.
And we've unpacked how that seemingly innocent assumption acts as a powerful colonial tool.
We've explored how the Métis are in reality a distinct, fiercely independent political nation. They were born on the plains of Western Canada. They developed their own complex economy, their own diplomatic alliances, and they secured brilliant military victories to protect their sovereignty. But they were systematically devastated by the Canadian state's scrip system.
Right, the individual coupon.
Yeah, they were swindled out of millions of acres of land by predatory speculators, aided by a government that actively refused to honor their collective nationhood.
And the critical takeaway is that this struggle for sovereignty did not end in the 19th century. It continues today, just on a different battlefield. The fight has moved from the plains to the courtrooms and the census forms.
To the paperwork.
Exactly. The modern legal system, through narrow decisions like Pauli, and the statistical system, through deeply flawed census data, actively work to erase that specific political history. They legally reduce the Métis to a broad biological category of mixedness, which opens the floodgates for hundreds of thousands of individuals with absolutely no connection to the historic Métis nation to claim the identity.
It dilutes the political power of the true nation and papers over the history of dispossession. And this brings everything right back to you listening to this right now. We interact with administrative labels constantly. Every time you check a box for your race, your ethnicity, your gender, or your marital status, the system encourages you to view that box as an objective, unchangeable truth.
But those checkboxes are deeply inherently political. They are constructed by institutions of power. They dictate who receives resources, who is granted legal protection, who is clearly seen by the state, and who is quietly erased from the map.
The bureaucracy forces us to constantly negotiate our own identities, but always on the state's terms, using the state's language. And that is why Andersen concludes his book with an incredibly poignant, provocative thought. He points to a famous prophecy attributed to the great Métis leader, Louis Riel.
It's a really powerful quote.
Riel once said, "My people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back." For over a century, the state's legal definitions, its scrip commissions, and its statistical labels have functioned like a heavy blanket designed to keep the true political identity of the Métis nation asleep, trapped in this endless, confusing nightmare of mixedness.
Which leaves us with a fascinating question to consider moving forward. If the entire process of begging for recognition from the state only results in being forced to wear a name tag that isn't yours, what happens when a community simply stops asking the state for permission to exist? What happens when a nation decides to tear up the census form, turn its back on the colonial courts, and begins demanding its peoplehood entirely on its own terms?
No, that is a deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time.